the seamstress who mended more than clothes, until they found her true workshop. Isabelle Hartwell counted stitches by candlelight, 47 precise knots per inch, on fabric that shouldn't exist. The thread gleamed with an unnatural luminescence in her cramped workshop above Morrison's haberdashery, and the patterns she followed came from no earthly sewing manual. It was October 12, 1889, in Providence, Rhode Island, and Isabelle had been accepting these peculiar commissions for 8 months, jobs that paid 5 times the normal rate, for alterations that defied every law of textile work she had learned in 20 years of sewing. The mystery began when Dr. Edmund Blackwood appeared at her door with a gentleman's coat that had been torn in ways fabric simply couldn't tear. The garment looked like ordinary wool, but when Isabelle touched it, the material felt warm, almost alive, pulsing gently beneath her fingertips. Dr. Blackwood explained that the coat had been damaged in a laboratory experiment and required discreet repair. He placed $10 silver on her workbench, enough to feed a family for 2 months, with one condition: she must work on it only after midnight, and never speak of it to anyone. Isabelle had built her reputation as Providence's finest seamstress through 12 years of meticulous work. Her tiny shop served the wives of ship captains, the daughters of textile mill owners, and occasionally the mistresses of men who preferred their alterations done discreetly. She had mended everything from wedding gowns torn by nervous brides to coats damaged in duels that officially never happened. But these midnight commissions were different. The fabrics behaved like living tissue, healing themselves as she worked, leaving repairs that were stronger than the original material. Dr. Blackwood began visiting weekly, always after the clock tower struck 11, always carrying another impossible garment wrapped in oiled paper, a lady's dress with burn holes that arranged themselves in perfect mathematical spirals, a child's coat with tears that formed constellation patterns, gentlemen's waistcoats marked with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Each piece required hours of work using thread that Dr. Blackwood provided, thread that glowed faintly and felt warm to the touch, as if it carried its own inner fire. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in February, when Isabelle accidentally pricked her finger while working on a priest's cassock. A drop of her blood fell onto the strange fabric, and instead of staining it, the material absorbed the blood completely. For several heartbeats, the entire garment pulsed with a dim red light that seemed to follow the pattern of her own heartbeat. The fabric had drunk her blood like a thirsting creature. That night, Isabelle experienced vivid dreams unlike any she had ever known. She saw vast laboratories filled with tables bearing not scientific instruments, but human bodies in various states of dismemberment. She saw women like herself, seamstresses working by candlelight, their fingers bleeding as they sewed human skin with glowing thread. She woke screaming, but by morning convinced herself it had been nothing more than a nightmare, brought on by working too many late hours. But the dreams returned every night, each one more detailed than the last. She began to understand that the fabric she was mending wasn't fabric at all. The warm, pulsing material that healed itself under her needle was human skin, preserved and treated through some unholy process she couldn't begin to comprehend. The glowing thread was made from human sinew, somehow kept alive and luminous through methods that belonged in no Christian world. Before I continue with what Isabelle discovered in Dr. Blackwood's true laboratory, I need to know you're prepared for this revelation. If you've ever suspected that someone in your community was hiding something darker than their public reputation suggested, write "I see the signs" in the comments along with your city. Subscribe now, because what Isabelle found in the basement beneath Providence General Hospital will shatter everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between medicine and monstrosity. The revelation came when Isabelle followed Dr. Blackwood one November night. Instead of returning to his announced residence on Benefit Street, he descended into the basement tunnels beneath Providence General Hospital. Isabelle crept after him through a maze of corridors that led deeper underground than any hospital should need to go. The walls were lined with cabinets containing specimen jars, but the contents weren't the typical medical curiosities she might have expected. Each jar contained what appeared to be swatches of fabric, but Isabelle's trained eye recognized them immediately as pieces of the same impossible material she had been mending for months. Human skin, treated and preserved, waiting to be sewn into garments that would serve purposes she was only beginning to understand. Some specimens were marked with dates going back decades. Others bore labels indicating the age and condition of the donor, though donor seemed far too voluntary a word for what she was witnessing. Dr. Blackwood's true workshop occupied a chamber that had been carved from the bedrock beneath the hospital. The room contained not sewing machines, but surgical tables arranged in precise rows. Each table bore restraints designed to hold a human form motionless during procedures that Isabelle's seamstress mind could reconstruct from the evidence before her. Cutting instruments that could section skin in perfect geometric patterns. Needles designed not for thread, but for the insertion of preservative chemicals that would keep tissue alive and pliable long after it should have died. But the most horrifying discovery was a series of completed garments hanging from hooks along the far wall, coats, dresses, and cloaks that Isabelle recognized as pieces she had mended in her workshop above Morrison's haberdashery. Each garment was made entirely from human skin that had been treated, dyed, and sewn with luminous thread made from human sinew. The clothing moved slightly in the still air of the chamber, as if the skin retained some memory of life. Isabelle understood with sickening clarity that she had been an unwitting participant in Dr. Blackwood's systematic harvest of human beings. The people who had worn these skin garments were the poor, the immigrant, the forgotten residents of Providence whose disappearances would generate no official investigation. Dr. Blackwood had been selecting victims who could vanish without consequence, then using his medical knowledge to preserve their skin for purposes that violated every natural and divine law. The glowing thread she had been using wasn't just made from human sinew, it was made from the nerve fibers of his victims, somehow kept alive and responsive to electrical impulses. This explained why the completed garments seemed to move on their own, why they felt warm to the touch, and why they had absorbed her blood so readily. They were still alive in some fundamental way, waiting for someone to wear them and complete Dr. Blackwood's true purpose. That purpose became clear when Isabelle discovered Dr. Blackwood's journal, left open on a desk near the surgical tables. The entries revealed that he had been conducting experiments in consciousness transfer for nearly a decade. The skin garments were vessels designed to house the preserved consciousness of murder victims, allowing their memories and personalities to be accessed by whoever wore the clothing. Dr. Blackwood believed he could create a library of human experience, preserving the minds of interesting individuals by housing their consciousness in garments made from their own preserved flesh. The most recent journal entry was dated the previous day and described Dr. Blackwood's satisfaction with the quality of repairs that the Irish seamstress had been providing to his collection. He noted that Isabelle's blood had bonded particularly well with the preserved skin, suggesting that she would make an excellent addition to his collection of consciousness-bearing garments. Her skill with needle and thread, combined with her growing understanding of his work, would make her an ideal candidate for preservation. Isabelle realized she had walked into a trap. Dr. Blackwood's midnight visits to her shop hadn't been about mending damaged garments. They had been about studying her, evaluating her skills, and gradually exposing her to the properties of preserved human skin to see how she would react. Her dreams hadn't been nightmares brought on by overwork. They had been the memories and experiences of Dr. Blackwood's previous victims, seeping into her consciousness through contact with their preserved remains. The sound of footsteps in the corridor told Isabelle that Dr. Blackwood was returning to his workshop. She had perhaps minutes before he discovered her presence among his collection of horrors, but as she looked for an escape route, she noticed something that changed everything about her understanding of the situation. One of the skin garments hanging from the wall bore a label that read, "Dr. Edmund Blackwood, preserved November 1881. The man who had been visiting her shop, the person she knew as Dr. Blackwood, was himself wearing one of the consciousness-bearing garments. The original Dr. Blackwood had been one of the first victims of this preservation process, and his consciousness had been housed in a garment made from his own skin. But whoever was wearing that garment now, controlling the preserved consciousness of the real Dr. Blackwood, was someone else entirely. Someone who had been using the doctor's knowledge and reputation to continue the harvesting of human beings for an even more sinister purpose. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by voices. Multiple people were approaching the workshop, and from their conversation, Isabelle understood that she had stumbled upon not just the work of a single mad doctor, but an entire organization dedicated to the preservation and manipulation of human consciousness. The skin garments were being distributed to members of Providence's most respected families, allowing them to wear the memories and experiences of murder victims like clothing accessories. But Isabelle had one advantage that the approaching conspirators didn't know about. Her months of working with the preserved skin had created a connection between her consciousness and the collective memories housed in the garments. She could feel the presence of dozens of murder victims, their preserved minds reaching out to her through the skin clothing they had been transformed into. They were trying to communicate, to share information that could expose the full extent of the conspiracy. As the voices grew louder, Isabelle pressed her hands against the nearest skin garment, and opened her mind to whatever the preserved consciousness within it was trying to tell her. The flood of memories that rushed into her awareness was overwhelming. Images of Providence's most prominent citizens participating in the selection and harvest of victims, names of powerful families who had been wearing consciousness-bearing garments for decades, and most importantly, the location of a master list that documented every person who had been transformed into a garment, and every person who was wearing one. The preserved consciousness that had flooded Isabelle's mind belonged to Sarah Mills, a young seamstress who had worked in Providence before Isabelle's arrival. Sarah's memories revealed that there had been a succession of seamstresses recruited to repair and maintain the skin garments, each one working for several months before being harvested herself. Isabelle was simply the latest in a long line of women whose needle skills had been exploited before their consciousness was preserved in clothing made from their own bodies. But Sarah's memories also contained crucial information about escape routes from the underground chamber, and the location of evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy to authorities who weren't already participants in the horror. More importantly, Sarah knew which members of Providence's police force and government were themselves wearing consciousness-bearing garments, their original minds suppressed by the preserved personalities of previous victims. The approaching voices belonged to Dr. Blackwood's current controller, and 3 other individuals wearing consciousness garments. Isabelle recognized their voices as belonging to prominent members of Providence society, but she now understood that these people had been replaced by the preserved minds of murder victims, who had been forced to take over their bodies and continue the harvesting process. The conspiracy was self-perpetuating. Each generation of victims was compelled to create the next generation of victims in an endless cycle of consciousness theft and bodily possession. Isabelle used Sarah's memories to navigate through the workshop to a hidden cabinet that contained Dr. Blackwood's master records. The ledger documented over 200 people who had been harvested for consciousness preservation over the past 15 years, along with a corresponding list of prominent Providence citizens whose original minds had been replaced with the consciousness of victims. The city's mayor, police chief, several judges, and dozens of business leaders were all wearing the preserved minds of people they had helped to murder. But the most shocking entry in the ledger was the final page, which contained Isabelle's own name with a date marked for the following week. Her measurements had been recorded along with notes about the quality of her needlework and her growing sensitivity to the properties of preserved skin. Blackwood's controller had been planning to harvest her consciousness and use her seamstress skills to continue maintaining the collection of skin garments, while her original personality was suppressed by the preserved mind of a previous victim. The voices were now just outside the workshop chamber, and Isabelle could hear the clink of surgical instruments being prepared. But she had one final advantage that the conspirators couldn't have anticipated. Her months of contact with preserved human consciousness had created connections not just with individual victims, but with the collective awareness of everyone who had been transformed into a consciousness-bearing garment. They were all linked through the network of preserved skin and luminous sinew, creating a shared mind that included the memories and knowledge of hundreds of murder victims. This collective consciousness had been waiting decades for someone who could serve as a conduit between the preserved minds and the living world. Isabelle's seamstress skills had made her particularly sensitive to the properties of the preserved materials, but her willingness to listen to the memories contained within the skin garments had opened a channel of communication that allowed the victims to coordinate their resistance to their captors. As Dr. Blackwood's controller entered the workshop with his assistants, Isabelle felt the collective consciousness of the preserved minds flowing through her awareness. She was no longer just herself, but a vessel containing the memories, skills, and determination of hundreds of people who had been murdered and transformed into clothing. Their combined knowledge included not just the full extent of the conspiracy in Providence, but connections to similar operations in Boston, New York, and at least 6 other major cities along the eastern seaboard. The consciousness preservation conspiracy was national in scope, with preserved minds being traded between cities like valuable commodities. Wealthy families could purchase garments containing the consciousness of artists, scholars, or skilled craftspeople, temporarily accessing their abilities and knowledge by wearing their preserved skin. The poor and marginalized were being systematically harvested to provide consciousness garments for the entertainment and enrichment of the powerful. But the collective consciousness flowing through Isabelle also contained something the conspirators had never anticipated: the combined rage and determination of hundreds of murder victims who had been waiting decades for the chance to expose their killers and rescue future victims. Through Isabelle, they could finally act in the physical world, using her body and mind as an instrument of justice that had been building power for years. When Dr. Blackwood's controller approached Isabelle with a syringe full of preservation chemicals, she was ready for him. The collective consciousness of the preserved minds guided her movements as she turned to face her captors. Her voice, when she spoke, carried not just her own words but the testimony of every person who had been murdered and transformed into a consciousness-bearing garment. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything recorded in Providence's official history. Isabelle, channeling the combined knowledge and determination of hundreds of preserved minds, systematically exposed each of the conspirators' true identities and the crimes they had committed. She recited the names of every person who had been harvested, the dates of their murders, and the current locations of the consciousness garments that housed their preserved minds. More importantly, the collective consciousness flowing through Isabelle knew the locations of evidence caches throughout Providence that contained documentation of the conspiracy dating back 15 years. Hidden in basements, buried in gardens, and sealed in bank vaults were records, photographs, and preserved specimens that could prove every aspect of the horror that had been consuming the city's most vulnerable residents. But the most powerful weapon the preserved consciousness had given Isabelle was knowledge of which authorities in Providence were still controlled by their original minds and could be trusted to act on evidence of the conspiracy. The collective awareness of the murder victims had been observing the city's power structure for years,
identifying individuals who were not wearing consciousness garments and who might be willing to investigate crimes that implicated some of Providence's most respected families.
The final confrontation took place, not in Dr. Blackwood's underground workshop, but in the office of District Attorney Harrison Clark, one of the few high-ranking officials in Providence who was still controlled by his original consciousness. Isabelle arrived at his home at midnight, carrying Dr. Blackwood's master ledger, and guided by the combined memories of hundreds of murder victims who could provide testimony about their own deaths and the identities of their killers. Clark's investigation, supported by evidence provided through Isabelle's connection to the Preserved Consciousness Network, ultimately exposed the full scope of the conspiracy. Raids on dozens of prominent Providence homes recovered consciousness-bearing garments that contained the preserved minds of murder victims spanning 15 years. Forensic examination of the skin garments provided physical evidence of systematic torture and murder that could not be dismissed or explained away. The trials that followed were unlike anything in American legal history. Witnesses included not just living people who had observed crimes, but the preserved consciousness of murder victims who could testify about their own deaths through Isabelle's mediation. The collective awareness housed in the consciousness garments provided testimony that was more detailed and accurate than any conventional witness could have offered, describing not just individual murders, but the full organizational structure of the conspiracy. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the extent to which the consciousness preservation conspiracy had infiltrated American society. Evidence recovered from Providence led to investigations in 12 other cities, exposing a network of consciousness harvesting operations that had been trading preserved minds like luxury goods for over 2 decades. Wealthy families throughout the eastern United States had been purchasing consciousness garments that allowed them to temporarily access the skills and memories of murdered artists, scholars, and craftspeople. The conspiracy's reach extended into the highest levels of American government and business. Senators, judges, industrial leaders, and even members of wealthy families had been wearing consciousness garments during important meetings and decisions, effectively allowing the preserved minds of murder victims to influence policy and commerce throughout the region. The implications for American democracy and justice were staggering. How many crucial decisions had been made not by elected officials, but by the consciousness of people who had been murdered to create luxury garments for the powerful. Isabelle Hartwell, the Irish seamstress, who had stumbled upon this horror while trying to make an honest living mending clothes, became the key witness in the largest criminal conspiracy trial in American history. Her ability to channel the collective consciousness of the murder victims made her an unprecedented legal witness, someone who could provide testimony not just from her own observations, but from the preserved memories of hundreds of people who had been killed to serve the entertainment needs of the wealthy. But the most profound impact of the consciousness preservation conspiracy's exposure was the realization that the boundary between life and death could be manipulated through scientific methods that violated every ethical and religious principle of American society. The preserved consciousness garments raised questions about the nature of identity, mortality, and justice that philosophers and theologians would debate for generations. The preserved minds housed in the consciousness garments were neither fully alive nor completely dead. They retained memories, personalities, and awareness, but existed in a state of suspended animation that depended on their integration with the preserved skin and sinew of their own bodies. This created legal and ethical dilemmas that had never been confronted before. What rights did preserved consciousness have? Could they be considered legal witnesses to their own murders? Were they victims or evidence? Isabelle spent the remainder of her life serving as an intermediary between the preserved consciousness collective and the living world.
The connection she had developed with the murder victims' preserved minds could not be severed, and she continued to channel their memories and testimony in ongoing investigations and trials. Her seamstress shop became a unique center for communication with consciousness that had been preserved beyond natural death, attracting researchers, law enforcement officials, and family members seeking closure about disappeared relatives. The consciousness preservation conspiracy had one final revelation that emerged years after the initial trials concluded. Many of the preserved minds housed in the skin garments had retained not just memories of their own deaths, but knowledge of other crimes and conspiracies they had observed during their extended existence as consciousness-bearing garments. Wealthy families who had purchased and worn these garments had unknowingly exposed themselves to the preserved awareness of their victims, creating a vast network of criminal intelligence that spanned decades of American history. Through Isabelle's mediation, preserved consciousness testified about corruption, murder, fraud, and conspiracy involving some of America's most powerful families. The consciousness garments had been present at private meetings, family gatherings, and business negotiations where crimes were planned and executed. The preserved minds had been forced to observe and remember everything their wearers experienced, creating an archive of criminal evidence that was more comprehensive than any conventional investigation could have assembled. This led to a second wave of prosecutions that continued for over a decade, as preserved consciousness provided evidence of crimes that had been committed by people who thought their actions were private and unobserved. The consciousness preservation conspiracy had inadvertently created the most comprehensive criminal intelligence network in American history, with murder victims serving as unwilling witnesses to decades of additional crimes committed by their killers and the wealthy families who purchased their preserved minds. Isabelle Hartwell died in 1923, still serving as the primary conduit between the preserved consciousness collective and the living world. Her funeral was attended not just by living mourners, but by representatives of dozens of families whose murdered relatives had found justice through her testimony. The collective consciousness of the preserved minds had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the systematic exposure and prosecution of their own killers from beyond the grave. The preserved consciousness garments themselves were eventually destroyed in controlled fires that released the trapped minds to whatever existence awaited them after their extended suspension between life and death. But the evidence they had provided through Isabelle's testimony resulted in convictions that reshaped American understanding of criminal conspiracy, individual rights, and the nature of consciousness itself. Modern researchers still study the consciousness preservation conspiracy as a unique example of how scientific knowledge can be perverted to serve the most horrific purposes. The case established legal precedents for crimes against human consciousness that continue to influence courts dealing with advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence. More importantly, it demonstrated that even the most sophisticated and powerful criminal conspiracies contain the seeds of their own destruction. The victims they create retain the knowledge and determination necessary to expose their killers, given the right circumstances and intermediary. If this story has made you more aware of the vulnerable people in your community who might disappear without generating official investigation, please share it with others who need to understand these risks. Subscribe for more historical cases where ordinary people uncovered extraordinary crimes through careful observation and moral courage. Before you go, take a moment to consider, are there people in your community whose disappearances would go unnoticed by authorities? Are there skills or knowledge in your community that might make certain individuals targets for exploitation? Isabelle Hartwell's story reminds us that the most sophisticated crimes often depend on the invisibility of their victims, and that sometimes the best defense against predators is simply ensuring that everyone in our community is noticed, valued, and remembered. Remember, Isabelle's most powerful tool wasn't supernatural ability or legal authority. It was her willingness to listen carefully to voices that others ignored and her courage to act on information that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. In our modern world where technology creates new opportunities for exploitation and manipulation, her example of careful observation and fearless testimony is more relevant than ever. Next week we'll investigate another case where skilled craftspeople became unwitting participants in crimes that violated the basic dignity of human life. Until then, remember that the most important work often involves listening to the voices of people who can no longer speak for themselves, and having the courage to repeat what they tell you, no matter how powerful the people who want their stories to remain hidden.